Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Syrian Israeli front has been relatively quiet, except for sporadic reports of Israeli aerial operations against Iranian logistical targets. That said, after U.S. President Donald Trump signed a proclamation recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, there are concerns that following the formation of the next Israeli government, tensions will rise along this frontier. To discuss these concerns, we're joined here in the studio by Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute of Strategy and Security and a lecturer at Shalem College. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Jonathan Spire, who is a fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security as well. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader update on the latest developments on that frontier.
There indeed seems to have been a relative lull on the Israeli-Syrian front, or actually the Israeli-Syrian Iranian front as of late. Not too frequent incidents, or at least none have been reported lately, where the Iranians have been trying to smuggle weapons via Syria to Lebanon, to Hezbollah, or if they didn't try to smuggle the weapons themselves, then precision equipment in order to add such kits to the missiles based in Lebanon. And therefore, it seems as if the Russian pressure on both Iran and Syria has been working. Russia, of course, has an interest in stabilizing Syria in order to get some sort of formula in the various peace talks, mostly the Russian-led peace talks in the Astana process. But also, it is interesting to see that even though President Trump came out with his announcement regarding the recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan, which was justified by adding stability, even though it seems counterintuitive to say that what he has been doing will add to stability. Right now, perhaps because of the elections in Israel, there has been no conflagration on this front. So perhaps we are now waiting for the formation of the next Israeli government to see the next moves, which may also include the unveiling of the Trump peace plan.
Dr. Lerman?
Well, at the bottom of this is, of course, a power relationship which has become increasingly unequal. Israel is quite powerful. The Israeli Air Force dominates the Syrian airspace. Any Syrian attempt, bravado and bluster aside, to retake the Golan by force is doomed to a catastrophic military failure that Syria can barely afford in an era in which the Syrian state and the Syrian military have been reduced to a shadow of their old self. So we need to, first of all, remind ourselves that this is the reality. And moreover, Trump did little more than recognize what to most or almost all Israelis now is a self-evident truth, that given the nature of the Syrian regime, given its fragility, given what has happened in Syria since 2011, when the last attempts to negotiate the future of the Golan were abandoned, there is no prospect whatsoever of this area, which is populated by Israelis and by Druze who are increasingly pro-Israeli, will ever revert to Syrian rule.
Dr. Spire?
Yeah, well, I think that's pretty clear. And then again, despite the statements over the last few days by Syrian Foreign Minister Walid Muallim, as was remarked upon here, threatening military action and saying that Syria has not abandoned the military option. You know, if one looks at the situation on the ground, there are estimates which suggest that the Syrian Arab Army today may consist of as little as 50,000 fighters that can actually be put into the field, men that can actually put in the field and operate as fighters. So it's tiny. The Syrian Arab Army is a shell of itself after nearly a decade now of civil war. It's also worth remembering from the Syrian government's point of view that while it may well still retain, or certainly does still retain, the desire to recapture the Golan Heights, it has rather more pressing territorial business on hand at the present time, given that while it has certainly won the war in the sense that it certainly preserved its existence, it still only actually rules over around 60% of Syrian territory. So certainly if we're talking about territorial reconquest on the part of the Syrian government and Syrian Arab Army, it has rather more urgent matters at hand than an area of land that was lost to it more than half a century ago.
I think it's also important to know that specific press conference you were talking about was in the presence of the foreign minister of Venezuela, and the decision by the United States was, of course, something that enraged the Syrian regime. But at the same time, the rhetoric that was stated there was leveled not only towards the American decision in Israel, but against the American sphere, if you will, of targeting its allies. Mr. Oren?
I beg to differ with my two esteemed colleagues, and especially Dr. Colonel Lerman, who knows full well the history of the Yom Kippur War and the ratio of forces estimated before and perhaps proven by the war. This, of course, had nothing to do with President Sadat's decision to reignite the diplomatic process by a small war, which then, of course, was not so small after all. The Syrians could launch a missile or two or a barrage. We saw what happened when Hamas, by mistake, as they say, launched a rocket into the central Israeli district of Sharon. No one was hurt, but Israel...
Dogs were killed.
I'm sorry?
4 dogs were killed and 7 people were wounded.
But again, you should let sleeping dogs lie. Because everyone agrees that de facto Golan has been under Israeli jurisdiction, there was no need to change the situation. And a few days ago at the Republican-Jewish coalition, President Trump related what happened. He said that Ambassador Friedman, the ambassador to Israel, came to him and asked, "Sir, why don't you announce it?" And he said, "Well, fine, yeah, why not?" So there was no staff work. There was no national security mechanism behind it, as one would expect from the National Security Council, Department of Defense, Department of State, Central Intelligence Agency. So it was a whim, and we may yet feel the repercussions.
Dr. Lerman?
Well, I'm aware that there's a body of scholarship in Israel which has been warning us, my old friend Uri Bar Yosef and others, that we may be making the same mistake that we made with Sadat as regards the Golan Heights. Well, the shoe doesn't fit. Egypt was a country in the process of emerging from under the shadow of the Soviet Union. It had a huge gift to offer the United States. It was already in negotiations with the Americans. The war was used in order to basically ignite a political process sponsored by the United States, which Sadat successfully did. Here you have a pariah regime. Well, he may be supported by the Russians, who do not like him, but they enjoy having one client still alive in the region. Perhaps with Haftar in Tripoli, they'll have one more if he succeeds. But they definitely, will not risk their standing in the region in an Israeli-Syrian confrontation. They've learned a very bitter lesson when they provoked this in '67. Mm-hmm. And nobody else would stand by, well, maybe Venezuela. But the results could be disastrous to a regime that is hanging by a thread. This is the message we have been imparting to the Russians systematically.
Just 1 year ago, we won't go too far back, we had different analysis on Iran's victorious actions within the Syrian civil war, that it emerged as the most strong one, even preceding Russian interests to a certain degree. Now, following the U.S. sanctions that have put significant strain on the Islamic regime as well as the IRGC, we see certain parts of those so-called advisors being returned to Iran. We see also Hezbollah being calculated more on where it deploys its own militiamen, considering that it itself is under significant duress when it comes to its financing because, again, those sanctions weren't transferred as pledged by Iran to the Lebanese militia. To what degree does this impact the decision-making of the Assad regime?
Of the Assad regime? Well, I think if we're asking and talking about Iran, I think that we have to be clear on the dimensions and breadth of the Iranian project in Syria. And if we look at the dimensions and breadth of this, we should realize that the sanctions, whilst they have undoubtedly hit at the Iranians, and indeed the Israeli raids, whilst they've undoubtedly hurt the Iranians, have not fundamentally altered the contours of the extent and nature of the Iranian project in Syria, which is wide-ranging. It consists not only of building bases close to the border, not only of transferring weaponry through to Lebanon, but also the establishment of Hezbollah-type militias employing Syrian citizens themselves, also the creation...
Mobilization forces.
Yeah, such as we know about the 313 Battalion and such groups as that. Also, the National Defense Force created by the IRGC back in 2013, around 50,000 people. It's a lot of people. It's a separate group from the army, essentially controlled by the Iranians. Even also educational, and even we know about some demographic activities, bringing in some poor Shia from southern Iraq, and attempts to make links to Bedouin tribes east of the Euphrates. We're talking about a strategic project, which is not meant to bear fruit in the next few weeks, but rather in the Iranian approach, the next years. This is not something which I would say the contours of which have been fundamentally altered, not by the sanctions and not by the Israeli actions. And in order, I think, to have a proper assessment of the nature of that Iran project, we have to look at those dimensions. You ask about Assad. So I would say, and this goes back to the earlier point about the possible Syrian push at the Golan, I take issue with the analysis of Syria, which says the Assad regime is returning, the Assad regime is now strong again, we're back to status quo ante bellum. Not so. The people who've saved Assad are the Iranians and the Russians. It is they who are reaping the benefit of the victory, so-called. The regime itself remains very weak. So I think Assad probably doesn't like a lot of the growing Iranian internal strength inside the country. There's very little that he can do about it. No less a figure than his own brother, Maher Assad, and his vaunted 4th Armored Division, right? Today, essentially takes orders from the Iranians, as far as anyone can see.
Which the question still arises, to what degree will the Iranians force the Assad regime to maybe confront Israel at some point and launch a strike that may lead to a wider escalation?
Well, Assad, of course, will give the utmost precedence to his own survival. He will not commit suicide on the Iranians' behalf. However, he may also find it difficult once his diplomatic horizon has been closed because of the recognition of Israeli sovereignty. He may find it difficult to survive in the eyes of his own population. Mind you, yes, conditions have changed a lot, but the Israeli policy of not acknowledging, for instance, the destruction of the nuclear reactor for more than 10 years, some 11 years between 2007 and last year, Israel has kept silent about it. Everyone knew that he did it, but in order for Assad to save face, he didn't come out right and acknowledge it. Now, how many such taunts can Assad survive? He may decide on his own emotional calculus to act against his best interests. Again, to launch a couple of missiles just to show that he's keeping the flame alive. Not necessarily to go to war, but to put Israelis on edge, especially Israeli citizens, and not necessarily in the Golan itself. He can launch a missile into Galilee, into central Israel, and then say that the accounts are still open, the book is still open, and we will meet again.
Dr. Lerman, when we're looking at the Israeli policy or the IDF strategy, the paper that was published under IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot, The core threat came from Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hezbollah that was spread out at the time also in Syria, and different Iranian-backed forces that operate within Syria.
As for now, yes.
Is this going to change in the near future? Do you see the current new IDF chief of staff thinking a new strategy altogether with the commando battalions, now suddenly being diverted to a different sort of tactical measure?
Look, the beauty of the Syrian military is that it is a regular military, which means that the IDF knows full well how to destroy it with a systemic attack on its targets. It cannot vanish, it cannot hide. Hezbollah is by now increasingly semi-regular force. And that actually makes it more vulnerable to some Israeli capabilities than was the case 13 years ago when we fought in Lebanon. But the Syrian military is classical fodder for the accurate fire capabilities of the Israeli Air Force, and not just the Israeli Air Force. Israel has I think, cutting edge in the capacity to destroy armor from a distance. I think we are ahead of the curve compared to other militaries, and this is why a good part of the international community comes to Israel for these capabilities. And so the Syrians would that would be a totally foolhardy venture if they think that they can control the escalation steps or sustain escalation dominance in any such situation. But in order to tuck sense into Assad's head, we need to sustain the Russian channel. This is why the visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu to Moscow, with all the attending fanfare, which was probably related to the election campaign, but nevertheless was a very, very important message for him to be so well received by Putin. The same week of the American declaration is a very sharp message to Assad by his Russian co-sponsor. Make no mistake, we will help you survive. If you tangle with the Israelis, you're on your own.
Dr. Speyer?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And I would say, the Israeli interest in keeping that channel open and the very large volume of trips that Netanyahu has made since September 30th, 2015, since the Russian planes first appeared over the skies of Syria, is not surprising. It's a clear Israeli interest. And I think with regard to the kind of message that Eran is talking about, an extremely effective channel, I would add to that a certain warning only, which is that I think there are some in Israel who've, in my view at least, overestimated the potential of the Russian connection, in the sense that there are those who have said or have posited that Israel could use that connection to leverage the Iranians out of Syria via the Russians. This is a step too far, in my opinion.
Which is unlikely.
It's very unlikely. The Russians, from their point of view, would say, well, we've already done a great deal for you. Do you really expect us to expand that amount of capital on a country which, after all, at least in the war for Assad's survival, has been on the same side as us? Mm-hmm. So I think one can't take it beyond a certain point, but up until that point, at least, this, of course, has been an absolutely vital connection and has played a vital role.
Mr. Oren?
Well, earlier, you asked about the new Chief of Staff, Aviv Kochavi. He has been the commanding general of the Northern Front, just like his predecessor, Gadi Eisenkot. He knows the area very well. Much earlier, he was a brigade and even earlier battalion commander in Lebanon. And the question for Israel is, should we look at this front as a unitary one with two sectors, or can one isolate the Syrian front from the Lebanese front if a war takes place in either one? And because this time around Hamas may join the fray by trying to help or being asked to help the northern brethren by opening a new front from the south, Israel would hope that whatever it does in the north stays local, either Lebanon or Syria. This is distinct from the Iranian entrenchment. On the Iranian front in Syria, Israel has been victorious and resoundingly so. This is an achievement without any caveats. There is no footnote here. It was General Eisenkot's plan. He executed it, and indeed, the Iranians, who started out by wishing to have a wing. This is usually unmanned aerial vehicles, but a wing at every Syrian airbase. A sort of a naval facility at every Syrian port, and an intelligence collection outpost everywhere along the Golan Heights were driven back, were reduced to the bare minimum.
Dr. Lerman?
True enough, and I would add that while we cannot use the Russians to get rid of the Iranians altogether, because if Putin were to come to Assad tomorrow and say, our common interest is to remove this Iranian provocative presence, then Assad would say, yes, but give me 2 of your best Spetsnaz divisions that can fill the void, because right now I'm surviving because of Iranian and Shiite militia boots on the ground. All true, but there is a smaller target that Israel can probably achieve with Russian help, which is to keep the Iranians off our border, and perhaps even more significantly, off the Jordanian border.
Perhaps after Idlib and after the Turkish-American Kurdish problem is solved, perhaps then, step by step, we will get to the Iranian problem.
Well, the question, to what degree, however, do the Russians have sway over the Iranians, considering the fact that the nuclear deal, which the Russians have tried to keep alive, is already ineffective. It doesn't really have the capacity to bolster Iran on the domestic level. It is in a lot of trouble, and the Russians haven't really leaned forward or offered significant help to try and bring the regime back up. Where is this relationship standing, considering that now also we see more and more the Iranians focusing on Iraqi-Iranian relations to, once again, as Dr. Spire mentioned earlier, to establish a contingent of land of territorial connectivity that will allow the Iranians to bolster and continue with their aspired strategy?
Well, first of all, let me mention that one of our scholars, Yossi Mansharov, is about to publish a paper delineating the possible physical road building project of the Iranians that would connect Kasr all the way to the Mediterranean. Well, again, that also may offer us a target. When it comes to Russian-Iranian relations.
Not only target, perhaps even a route for an armored force to penetrate Iran via land.
I don't think we have such ambitions. But when it comes to the Russians, I think that unlike Syria, which is a Russian asset, in fact, it is the one major place in which Putin, in addition to Crimea and the odd Georgian territory in Abkhazia, that's the one place where Putin has made his mark on the world arena. To put that at risk in the service of Iranian interests, when Russia certainly has no delusions about controlling or managing the Iran and Iranian purposes, I think would be, and is already now in the eyes of Putin, a major mistake that he's not going to make.
Dr. Spire?
So there are clear differences between the Russian and Iranian ambitions inside Syria. This is correct. And we're already seeing on the ground some examples of real tension, including shots fired between clients of the Russian regime within the Syrian security forces and clients of the Iranians. We saw the 4th Armored Division against Sohail Hassan's 5th Corps over a month ago in northern Hama province. And just 2 weeks ago in Daraa, right in the southwest, there was a clash between also members of the 5th Corps against the a checkpoint of state security of one of the 4 Syrian intelligence branches closely linked to the Iranians. So you can see already there are these kind of fissures, these kind of splits already into the Syrian regime itself in terms of differences between these two forces. I would add, however, or I would add in addition, that when we think of the balance of forces on the ground, so to speak, as was mentioned already, it was the Iranians on the ground who saved the Assad regime, not the Russians. The Russians did their job from the air and diplomatic support and weaponry, but the boots on the ground were Iranian, which means when it comes to the issue of control on the ground, or looking for what the Russian lever would be on the ground to insist on their point vis-a-vis the Iranians, that has a certain question mark about it, because the forces on the ground are, for the most part, or to a great extent, the ones which are loyal to the Iranians.
So we're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing statement and a short analysis on the possibilities for the near future. Dr. Lerman, we'll start with you.
Well, obviously, the Syrian regime will remain profoundly hostile. The loss of the Golan will not be papered over the same way that over the years they've reconciled themselves to the loss of Antakya to Turkey. By the way, in Syrian school maps, that part of Turkey still appears as if it's Syrian. But there's no imaginable prospect of the Syrians taking military action to reclaim what the French volunteered to give the Turks 80 years ago. However, over time, I believe the same will happen with the Golan.
Dr. Spire?
With regard to Antakya, it's an interesting point to note that in a certain sense, Antakya has become Syrian, since there's about 2 million Syrian refugees living there right now. This is not going to help Assad. In terms of the broader question, just to I think reiterate what was said at the beginning from my view, and people have said it also as well, the issue of Idlib is not yet resolved. The issue of the area east of the Euphrates is not yet resolved. 40% of Syrian territory remains outside of Assad's control. These are the issues which will come first on the agenda in terms of urgency. Only after that is any real possibility of this additional thing coming on.
So unless Assad controls 100% of Syria, or at least close to that, he's not really going to have that much leeway to work against...
It would seem to me, and I would add to that, again, that the notion of the regime coming back and being strong has to be complicated. The regime's side is strong, but what's strong within that is Iran and is Russia. So both in terms of territorial control and in terms of administrative and managerial control, even inside the 60% ostensibly controlled by Assad. Assad has a great deal of work to do establishing his authority at home before he can think about any adventures elsewhere.
One word?
Syria is a sideshow in the great American-Russian face-off.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Lerman, Mr. Oren, and Dr. Spire for being here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.